muchos años. La primera vez que coincidí con él fue cuando estaba empezando su carrera en Australia, bajo la dirección de Power, y posteriormente he coincidido con él en Warwick y también, ahora últimamente, también en Rojaste. Tenemos una amistad de cervezas también, hemos tomado cervezas, y desde que le conocí en Australia, Neve ha desarrollado una importante carrera en tema de resistencia herbicida, convirtiéndose actualmente en uno de los personajes más importantes dentro de este área científica. Dio recientemente una excelente conferencia en el congreso que realizó la Sociedad Argentina de Maleza y la Asociación Latinoamericana de Malezas en Buenos Aires, y estoy seguro que la charla que nos va a dar hoy va a ser igual de interesante que la que dio aquí en Argentina. Es un honor para mí, como digo, presentar por Neve, que va a dar su conferencia. Gracias por un aplauso.
Thank you, Jose, for the introduction. I'd just like to start out by thanking the organisers for inviting me to give this presentation and to spend some time in the beautiful city of Sevilla. I must apologise, my Spanish is very poor, so I will have to give this presentation in English, but I'm sure someone will tell me if I start to speak too quickly or if I become unclear. So the presentation I'm going to give should take, I think, about 45 minutes. As you can see from the title, what I would like to talk about is an exercise that was conducted as part of a workshop which was actually held in Spain last year. As I go through the presentation, I'll say a little bit more about that workshop. But this particular exercise, which was part of that workshop, was really to begin to consider what may be some research priorities in the area of weed ecology, weed science, weed management, and it brought together people working in agricultural weed management with people working in weed management in natural ecosystems, so people dealing with invasive plant species in natural ecosystems. So whilst the presentation I'm going to give will concentrate on some of the sort of agricultural context, because I think that's most relevant for us here, do bear in mind that what I present is also the viewpoint of other ecologists, weed ecologists working in natural ecosystems with invasive plants. So what I should really start out by acknowledging, for a number of reasons, is that this whole exercise was conducted by 35 scientists who attended this workshop. So really, for this presentation, I really have 35 co-authors. So it's important for me to acknowledge their part in what I'm going to present. What you see on the slide here is those people, no doubt some of whom you will recognise, and at least two of whom are in the audience here. And of course, the other important reason for pointing out that there are so many people involved is, in some sense, to make you aware that what I'm going to present is not just my view, it's trying to summarise the views of important questions from 35 different people working across a range of interests within weed science. So of course, if you'd have asked each of those people individually what they thought the priorities were, you may have got a somewhat different response from what I'm going to present, which is the collective view. So, just to start out very broadly, this slide is a summary of some research which was carried out about 10 years ago by Urca, which looked to summarise globally the impacts of different crop pests on crop production. And what you can see on that graph, for each of the different groups, so particularly where we'll look at pathogens, insect or animal pests and weeds, there's two bars, one of which summarises the actual potential yield loss which can be caused by by each of those different groups. So that's the yellow bar. And the green bar shows the actual loss. So what you'll notice is the actual loss globally for diseases, for particularly insect pests and for weeds, is about equal. So it's been estimated at about 10% for each of those groups. But what you'll also notice is that the potential loss from weeds is far greater than from any other group of organisms. So I think, I guess I'm talking to a group of people who understand the importance of weeds. But I think it's important for us as weed scientists to actually stress and point out that this fact that weeds can actually lead to greater crop yield losses than any other group of pests. Now, if I look at, so I work at Rothamsted in the UK, which has a long tradition of crop protection research. And if I look across the departments at Rothamsted, I see about 40 or 50 people working on insect pests, entomologists. I see about 30 or 40 people work as plant pathologists working on disease. And there's about 8 of us working on weeds. And I get the impression that tends to be a sort of picture which is repeated in many parts of the globe. So I guess some of the context for what I'm going to talk about today is perhaps a realisation that, the importance of weeds in crop protection and for maintaining crop yield is perhaps not always fully recognised in relation to, for example, the importance of diseases and the importance of pests. So I think we probably all recognise that global weed management faces a number of challenges, and we can think about what some of those challenges are. So certainly in Europe, and we talk about this a lot in the UK, this idea of sustainable intensification. So there's been an estimate that by 2050, so within 35 years, we're going to need to produce, globally, we're going to need to produce 70% more food. And we're going to need to do that on the same area of land, and we're going to need to increase production whilst reducing the negative environmental impacts of crop production. So that's a major challenge, and clearly weed management has a major part to play in that challenge. Again, I think we're all familiar with the many problems being caused by herbicide resistance. Again, this is a global problem. We recognise that in many parts of the world, crop rotations are becoming simplified, and there's a lack of diversity in weed management. Again, this has major implications for how we go about weed management, and maybe underpins some of the current major challenges associated with weed management. We're also facing global change, and the idea that with increased global change will come increasing problems with invasive species and weed species. There's also concerns about the environmental impact of weed management. So whether it be resulting from environmental pollution, perhaps associated with the use of herbicides, or the loss of biodiversity in agroecosystems. And finally, and again this is particularly relevant to a European audience, we're dealing with more and more regulation. So we're losing herbicide modes of action. And in Europe we're not able to grow genetically modified crops. So all of these factors are contributing to mean, in some sense, there's many challenges ahead for weed science, but also I would like to think it also means there's good times ahead for weed science, because there's many interesting and challenging questions that we need to address. So I put this warning up on the next slide, because what I'm about to present could be viewed to be a little bit provocative. So in 1999, at the Australian Weed Science Congress, which I attended as a freshly qualified, relatively young postdoc, my first postdoc position, Roger Cousin presented this paper with what I think you'll agree is quite a provocative title. Weed science doesn't have to be a contradiction engineering terms. Now, Roger, who was one of the co-authors and a major organiser of the workshop I'm going to talk about, Roger has a reputation for being quite challenging and quite controversial. And within this paper, Roger made the argument that too much of the weed science we do, he uses the term phenomenon fixation. What he's really trying to say there is we ask a lot of what questions. We ask a lot of questions about what happens if we do this or what happens in this system. But perhaps we don't ask enough questions about why that happens. And he also talked about this idea of catalogues of case studies. Now I think that's particularly true in the area I work in, which is herbicide resistance, where really if you look in the literature, there's many studies of herbicide resistance which just are very repetitive and look at sort of repeating and that's the same as this idea of a copycat study. Now, I think Roger made these criticisms, and I thought this was quite a inspiring talk in some way. But I also recognise that much of the research that I do, the criticisms that Roger was making could be applied, for example, to some of my own research. I'm not standing here and saying these things are bad. I'm actually reflecting on some of what I do to think about perhaps how we can think about doing weed science in the future. So, as an outcome, or many years later, I think this idea of this group called Andina, which is really a group of weed ecologists who got together with the idea of perhaps holding some novel workshops. This was really led by Roger Cousins and by Bruce Maxwell from Montana State University in the USA. And they had the idea to hold some slightly different weed ecology workshops, to get away from the normal conference format, to bring together small groups of weed ecologists internationally, and to really think about some novel ideas which could be applied in weed science, to generate some international collaboration. And one of their, also going back to sort of a previous slide about how important weed science is, one of the things they stated that they wanted to do with this group was to try and increase the profile and impact of research on weed and invasive plants. So as I say, the idea of this group was to hold these workshops. So the first one of these workshops was held in Montana, in the USA, in 2012, organised by Bruce Maxwell. And as I say, it brought together weed ecologists, weed scientists, and scientists working in natural ecosystems on invasive plants. And the first conference had three major themes, and that was to look at plant invasions in natural and managed ecosystems. We focused, one of the themes was on evolution and management of herbicide resistance, and the final one was on climate change and weed management. One of the outcomes of that workshop was a paper published in Weed Science, which really was a multi-author paper arising from, or authored by a number of people attending that workshop, which really was sort of a critique of the current state of weed research. And a major argument in that paper, which many people didn't agree with, this became quite a controversial paper, was that there become a separation between research into weed management and research into weed ecology. And we weren't really joining the two disciplines up as well as we could be. So anyway, to move on, following that workshop, the second workshop was held. The local organiser was Yuri Reticence, who's in the audience here today. So this second workshop was held in Velasque, in the Pyrenees in Spain. And the focus for that workshop, again, we had a number of themes which we focused discussions around. So one of those was spatial ecology. We talked about population genetics and adaptation, and also the seed and bug bank. But the part of the workshop that I want to present for the rest of my presentation is this horizon scan, and I'll come on to say a little bit about what we mean by horizon scan. So these horizon scanning exercises, there's been a number of them that now appear in the literature. And the idea of these horizon scanning exercises is to bring together a number of experts in a certain field and collaboratively identify research priorities for the future through discussion of ideas. Now, there's been a number of those horizon scans previously published. You can see there's one here that was published a few years ago, looking at the top 100 questions of importance of the future of global agriculture. There's another one here focused around ecology, and one here in plant science. And what we really wanted to do was a similar sort of exercise for weed ecology and management. So the way we started this exercise, and I led the exercise for the workshop, was prior to the workshop to ask all those people who were attending to provide a list of what they believed to be between 3 and 5 important questions that weed ecology, widely defined, should tackle in the next 5 to 10 years. So as I say, those questions were submitted before the workshop. Just to say a little bit about the people who attended the workshop. So you'll see, as I go through the rest of the presentation, you'll see a few of these word clouds. I don't know if some of you are familiar with these. Basically, this one shows the disciplines which were covered. We asked each participant in the workshop just to identify what they thought their main discipline, their main area of interest was. So this graphic here just really summarises the disciplines which were covered by the workshop, and the larger the writing, the greater the representation of that discipline. So clearly weed science, weed ecology, invasion ecology, but we also had social scientists, and we also had economists. So we did try to capture not just those working sort of at the forefront of weed science, but also people working around the edge, also in evolutionary biology, for example. We asked people to identify which continents they conducted their research in. So this figure really just demonstrates that we did have a fairly good global coverage. So the results of the exercise that I'm going to present does, at least to some extent, represent expertise from all parts of the globe. Obviously, with the workshop being held in Spain, we had a majority or the largest concentration of people from Europe. Also large numbers from North America and Australia, but also coverage from South America, Africa and Asia. One of the things we're very keen to do with the workshops support, we've had grants available to support attendance by young scientists. So I think there was a feeling amongst the workshop organisers that perhaps we weren't very good at attracting young people into the science of weed science. So this graphic just shows the sort of the age structure, if you like, just to make the point that this wasn't a group of sort of old fogies, or probably doesn't translate very well. It wasn't just a group of sort of old and established weed scientists. We did actually have a number of young people attend the workshop, and we had a mixture of people working in both agricultural and natural ecosystems, and we also had a good, what we consider to be a good balance. You know, we tried to ensure that there was representation by both male and female weed scientists. So the first thing I did prior to the workshop, we had, from the people attending, we had 128 questions submitted. And the first thing I did prior to the workshop was just trying to organise those questions into a number of different themes. And you can see those themes summarised there. So covering weed ecology and management, as we expect, a number of the questions were sort of related to weed ecology and management, but also a large number of questions related to the evolution of weeds. Climate change was important, and also importantly a number of questions related to policy as it relates to weed management and socioeconomics. So again, we feel we sort of covered a range of approaches and a range of questions relevant to weed science. So again, I said create one of these word clouds just to give you a feeling of, you know, the key words, if you like, which came out of those questions. And there's no particular surprises in here. We were talking about plant invasion, we were talking about ecology, agriculture. So again, perhaps this slide isn't particularly informative, but it was just my way of summarising all of those questions without listing 128 different questions. So the way we did this, we basically, I don't know if you can see here, all of these 128 questions were put on the wall at the workshop venue under the 7 different themes, and people were given time to go around and consider all of those questions. So we gave people about an hour and a half just to take in all of those questions and start to consider what they thought might be, from their own personal perspective, what were the really major questions in weed research. So this is just to give you an example of how we started to take all of those 128 questions and begin to get a consensus from the people attending the workshop of what they thought the most important questions might be. So I haven't put up this question for any particular reason. It's just an example of one of the questions which was submitted. And what we asked people to do then is to identify, we sort of did this on a gold, silver, bronze basis. We asked people to identify what they thought were the 5 most important questions and to give those questions 50 points. Then to pick another 5 questions which we called silver questions, which they thought were also important, perhaps not as important, and give those 10 points. And then another 5 questions which they gave 5 points to. So essentially everyone picked 15 questions and rated those as either a gold, silver or bronze question. And then we asked people to indicate on the cards which were on the wall, just to indicate if they picked that question as one of their priorities and whether it was gold, silver or bronze. And finally, for each question, we're then able to derive a total score based on ranking from the whole group of people. So initially what that enabled us to do is to take those questions and to start to get a feeling for what people felt were the most important. So I'm just going to present here what came out from the initial exercise as the 10 most important questions. And I think some of you may be, I was quite surprised, and I think some of you may be quite surprised at what came out as the priorities from that exercise. So these are ranked from 1 to 10. I haven't numbered them. The number 1 is at the top, number 10 at the bottom. So what came out, and again, this we might think, we may not, but I think, to me, this was quite surprising. The 2 top-ranked questions related to policy and socio-economics. Again, I can't memorise the questions exactly, but so the top-ranked question was, how can weed ecologists best engage with civil society, government and private enterprise to organise multi-stakeholder efforts to manage weeds? And the second top-ranked question was related to how weed scientists may work with social scientists to better tackle weed problems. And the question that ranked number 6, which is shown there, was about what's actually hampering the adoption of integrated weed management. So many of us, I'm sure, are involved in efforts to develop integrated weed management strategies, but I think we all recognise that one of the greatest challenges is actually to convince farmers to adopt that integrated weed management. So those were some of the top-ranked questions. There were then, some very different questions which related to how much we understand about the way that weeds adapt in agro-ecosystems. Now, obviously, herbicide resistance is the classic example of weed adaptation, but I think we looked at this more widely. So there was a question about what is the role of epigenetics in adaptation in weeds. Then there were some questions about climate change, so really asking questions about how important climate change will be for understanding weed ecology and weed management in the future. And finally, amongst that top 10, some questions which were more sort of based in understanding more fundamental weed ecology. So asking questions such as how important is weed diversity diversity in agroecosystems for ecosystem functioning. So starting to think about weeds not just as constraints to crop yield, which they clearly are, but also thinking about weeds in terms of the wider ecosystem services that they provide in agroecosystems. So that was the initial sort of scan of the questions. What we then went on to do is to talk about these things in greater detail through debate, further discussion, analysis of the results of that initial ranking of questions. This is Roger reflecting on those initial responses. We also ensured that we had some good time to relax and get out in the Pyrenees to think deeply about these things. And then finally, after a nice relaxing walk in the Pyrenees, we came back and we tried to converge all of those ideas into some key questions, which I'm now going to present. And we used beer as a way to collect our thoughts. So this is really cutting to the core of where we got to, and we eventually arrived at what we defined as 12 key questions, and we organised those under 5 major themes. And I'm going to go through each of those themes in a moment. I'm going to concentrate particularly on the one in the middle, which is transdisciplinary research. And I'm not going to say too much more about what we mean by transdisciplinary research now, because I'm going to come back to that. But we organise these questions under those related to global change, those related to thinking about scale in weed management, those related to interactions, so how weeds interact with other organisms in agroecosystems, and then finally adaptations, so how do weeds evolve in the face of weed management. So as I say, I'm going to briefly go through each of those themes and the questions which arose. So when we thought about climate change, when we thought about global change, we thought about this in quite a broad context, so we weren't just talking about climate change, although climate change was an important aspect. We talked about land use change, so how, for example, these efforts at sustainable intensification or more use of cropping land for bioenergy production, how land use change in the future might impact on weed management, how policy and regulation would impact on weed management in the future, so changing policy and regulation, and also how changes in technology could impact in the future. So this is really all about capturing how change in future may change the way that we think about or we conduct weed management. And I would say, and you'll see from the questions which come, do bear in mind that many of the people we were working with in this workshop were invasion ecologists. So these questions in particular do also capture management of weedy plants in natural ecosystems. So the four questions which came out under that theme were, how will global change, so here we are really talking about climate change specifically or predominantly, how will that change the distribution of weeds and their impact? Can we predict which ecosystems will be more or less vulnerable to future threats posed by weeds? There was a question, again largely driven by the invasion ecologists, about as the climate changes and as weed distributions change with that climate change, how will that impact how we define native and invasive species? So is a species which is moving its range in response to climate change, is that really an invasive species, or is that just a natural process which we have to accept as an inevitable consequence of climate change? And the final question, and I guess this one is more specific to agricultural weed management, is how can the risks from emerging weed control technologies be managed without stifling innovation? So I think there was a feeling within the room that, for example, the experience with genetically modified herbicide-resistant crops in the US hasn't been entirely positive because of major problems with herbicide resistance and a lack of weed management diversity. So there was a feeling for how do we incorporate those important new technologies into more integrated weed management systems. And again, I'm not convinced that these word clouds are too helpful, but again, what we did for each of those themes is then take the 128 questions and place each question under one of the 5 themes that we identified, and this is just sort of how keywords fell out for each of those themes. So the second major theme we identified was around scale, and when we were talking about scale, again, we were talking about scale on a number of different dimensions. So we were talking about temporal scale. So how do we think about weed management in the short term? What do we do this year to control this particular weed problem in this year? Or do we expand the horizon of weed management to really consider weed management over much longer time frames? Spatial. So again, should all weed management be considered on a field-by-field basis, or do we need to think about weed management in a much broader spatial context? And there was also some discussion about sort of the scale of weed management systems. So again, just trying to, this really relates to integrated weed management and ensuring that weed management is not solely or predominantly reliant on herbicides alone. So the two questions which emerged from that theme were: weed management is typically conducted at the field scale over short time scales. What improvements can be made by considering other spatial and temporal scales? And how can research assess the impacts of weeds and the efficacy of weed management across different spatial, temporal, and functional scales? Okay, so the third theme was this idea of better understanding how weeds interact with other components of agroecosystems, but also in natural systems. So here the invasion ecologists particularly talk about this idea of facilitation. So the fact that sometimes invasion of one species is facilitated by invasion of other species, leading to this process of invasion or meltdown, where you get, as I say, we get invasion of one species and then that opens up ecosystems to invasion by a whole host of other species. Of course, in an agricultural context, we also talked about the fact that weeds may deliver important ecosystem services, whether they're related to pollination or to providing habitat and shelter for natural enemies of other crop pests. But on the negative side, weeds may also act as hosts for pests and pathogens. And there was also questions about how we may better understand what's going on in the soil, how soil microorganisms may actually be important for understanding what's happening in weed communities. So the questions which emerged from that theme: what more do we need to learn about biotic interactions to provide better predictions for weed management? And how can weed management systems be designed to optimise trade-offs between production, biodiversity and environmental work? So the fourth thing, and I want to dedicate much of the end of the project to talking about the final one, which is transdisciplinary research, because I understand there's a focus in this conference on technology transfer, and I think these sort of transdisciplinary approaches begin to consider the importance of technology transfer. So the fourth thing was around the question of weed adaptation, and here obviously we talked a lot about herbicide resistance, but we also talked much more broadly about how important is adaptation of weeds to agroecosystems. So how readily are weeds able to adapt to any management strategy that we might employ to control them? So here, as I say, we talked about sort of the mechanisms which underpin weed adaptation, population genetics, resistance and GM crops, and how the sort of omics technologies may help us to better understand weed adaptation. So two questions emerging here: how important is contemporary evolution in determining establishment, spread and persistence of weeds, and how can we use knowledge of mechanisms of evolution to design sustainable weed management systems? Okay, so as I say, how am I doing for time? About 10 minutes left. So I want to finish off by talking specifically about this idea of transdisciplinary research, which I think was really the major focus or the major perspective which came out of the workshop. Now, particularly in North America, there was a workshop, I think it was last year, hosted by the National Academy of Sciences, to consider the major problems of herbicide resistance in GM crops in North America. And various people at that meeting described weeds as a wicked problem. And what that really means is that weed problems have multiple dimensions, so we can't just consider the sort of biophysical or the biological aspects of weed control, but we also need to consider cultural, economic, political and technological dimensions when we think about weeds. They're embedded across different levels of organisation, so when we think about weeds, we can think about individual plants and how we control individual plants. We can think at a field scale, we can think at the landscape scale. We probably argue that we need to think about weeds across all of those scales. Weed management involves multiple stakeholders, so from researchers through farmers, advisors and industry. Weeds have unpredictable population dynamics. And also, and again, I think this depends on what part of the world you come from and how you view weeds. But essentially weeds, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the undesirable impacts of weeds, and I think that's really the major focus for weed science, is to reduce those undesirable impacts. But there's also a recognition that weeds may deliver some important ecosystem services in agro-ecosystems. So there's also this problem of having to minimise the negative impacts of weeds while also trying to harness those positive attributes. So of course, I guess we can easily ask the question, what is this idea of transdisciplinary research? We've all heard of multidisciplinary research and interdisciplinary research, and here's just another new word that perhaps just, you could argue, brings more confusion than clarity. But it does seem to be a concept which is emerging in the literature, and it's really this idea of team science and bringing together a whole range of disciplines to understand the complexities of an issue. So the feeling, if we relate it to weed science, that perhaps as people involved in understanding the biology and management of weeds, or the ecology of weeds, we need to also engage with people, with farmers. I mean, perhaps that's obvious, but with policymakers, with politicians, and with industry. And we need to do that in a way in which research projects are actually conceived, which bring in all of those interests right from the outset of those projects, rather than scientists working in isolation and then trying to communicate the results of that science at the end of the research project. So, as I say, the questions which came out from this transdisciplinary angle were acknowledging that weed problems have ecological, economic, socio-economical and political dimensions, and how do we address these dimensions across different disciplines, and how can weed research engage with stakeholders to better understand and address complex weed problems. So I want to finish up in the last 5 minutes, just to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the research that I'm involved in currently in the UK, and maybe to try and demonstrate how we're trying to address some of these major problems in a transdisciplinary way. And I don't think we're perfect, I don't think we're doing that in a perfect way, but I'd just like to, as I say, use the end of my talk just to talk a little bit about what we're doing. So currently in the UK we have a very major problem with a species called blackgrass, which is Alipicurus myosauroides, and this problem is largely underpinned by herbicide resistance. So this picture was taken in July 2014. You can just about see a few patches of wheat. This is a wheat crop. You can see at the front of the picture a few relatively clear patches of wheat, but most of this field is just full of blackgrass. And this is about a month before harvest, so it's too late for the farmer to do anything to control that blackgrass. It's all set in seed. So this is pretty much a disaster for that farmer because that field is completely full of blackgrass. Many farmers in the UK have got to the situation where they see in this picture a month before harvest and deciding that they're just not even going to harvest that crop, because if they cut that crop, they can actually prevent the seed maturing on those blackgrass plants and ensure that all of those plants are not returning viable seed to the seed bank. So this picture here is from a field we visited. It's a bad example, but it's not exceptional. We really do have, in the last, blackgrass has been around for a number of years and it's always been a problem, always been prone to herbicide resistance. But in the UK we've got to a situation now where it really is. If you speak to farmers in the UK, this is far and away their number one issue on their farms. So just to give you a bit of background to some of what we've been doing, PhD student Craig Knight, in collaboration with Bayer, collected close to 100 blackgrass populations from across the UK in 2011. And his first objective was really just to establish what's the extent of resistance across the UK to ACCAs and ALS inhibiting herbicides. Now this wasn't a completely random sample. This was farmers who were having problems with blackgrass, so I don't want to give the impression that what Craig found was that of the 92 populations he worked with, all of them were resistant to ACCAs herbicides, and over 3/4 were resistant to ALS. Now those are the two major herbicide modes of action we have available for controlling blackgrass in wheat, the two post-emergence options. So pretty much all of those farmers have got very little options available for in-crop control of blackgrass, which begins to explain the picture I showed previously. What Craig also did was look for what were the important mechanisms underpinning that resistance. So again, many of you are familiar with that there are, broadly speaking, two types of herbicide resistance. So we have target site herbicide resistance, which is based on the herbicide target being insensitive to that herbicide, and metabolic resistance, what I've labelled NTSR, non-target site resistance, which is based on metabolism of herbicides. So what Craig found when he was looking at ACCA's resistance, as I say, all populations were resistant. He found 79 of those 92 populations had both of those mechanisms present, and the other 13 only had non-target site resistance. Now, why is that important? It's because it's really demonstrating that this non-target site resistance is the major enemy here. I think in the past, because it's easier to detect and diagnose target site resistance, we found target site resistance and then said, well, that's the major mechanism. What we're finding here is that target site resistance is almost always underpinned by non-target site resistance. And the reason that's important is because non-target site resistance can give you a very broad spectrum of resistance to a whole host of modes of action. So it's a sort of generalist type of resistance. The picture wasn't too much different for ALS resistance, although there were a few populations, 9 out of 92, which only had non-target site resistance. So what this has shown us is that non-target site resistance, which we know less about, is really key. It's really a key mechanism of resistance in blackgrass. So we have been fortunate enough to get funding for this large project in the UK to understand multiple and particularly non-target site-based herbicide resistance in grass weeds. And the project tries to do that right from the level of understanding the fundamental genetic basis and biochemical basis of resistance right through to management in agroecosystems. So it's not, I don't want to claim that's truly transdisciplinary in the way that I defined it, but what we have done is assemble a large team to tackle this blackgrass problem in the UK. And many of the people working in this problem have never worked with weeds before. So we brought in ecologists, evolutionary biologists, people working in epigenetics, and people looking at land use change, quantitative genetics. So we're really trying to assemble this interdisciplinary team with a number of people who've never worked in weed science before. And I think that's really important because we have major problems with herbicide resistance. And these are ecological and evolutionary problems. And of course we need the expertise from people working in weed science, which I hope I am able to bring to the project. But I also think we need to acknowledge that sometimes we need to work with people from outside our own discipline to tackle these really very major challenges. So I've nearly finished. I just say a little bit more about this project. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much. It really just presents a picture of how we're tackling this problem through understanding the ecology of blackgrass, taking epidemiological approaches. I've got a couple of slides which say a little bit more about that. Understanding the genetics of resistance and its evolution, putting all of that insight together in models, and then trying to use those models to develop novel management strategies for blackgrass. So, as I say, I'm not going to present, it's a very big project, I'm not going to present an overview, but I just wanted to pick out a couple of things to tell you about the project which sort of relate to this idea of transdisciplinary research, working with farmers, working with other stakeholders in this problem. So the map shows you a network of 71 farms, which we're working with those farmers across the UK. Perhaps I should move on. That just shows the extent of what we're doing. One of the things we've been doing, and this work is led by Rob Freckleton, who's one of the partners in this project, is just on those 71 farms, going out and actually mapping blackgrass. So what we found in the first year of the project, we mapped blackgrass in 25,000 quadrats, so this was a lot of work, across those 71 farms. And we found that blackgrass was present in about 88% of those 25,000 quadrats. So blackgrass is everywhere. It's a major problem. We knew that, but we're just trying to quantify that in some sense. So what Rob and his team have been doing is going out to individual farms and actually breaking individual fields into 20 by 20 metre quadrats and going out and mapping blackgrass on those fields. And they'll do that over the course of this 4-year project to see what's happening to those populations over time. So this is just an example of a field with a particularly bad blackgrass problem. This is a field with a sort of medium problem, and this would be a field that does have blackgrass but only really in a single patch. And what Rob and his team are also beginning to do is use unmanned aircraft, so UAVs, to fly over these fields and take aerial images. And so they've got data that they've collected from the ground, and they're able to actually now start to fly drones over those fields and get some aerial imagery, and they've got data from the ground in order to ground truth those aerial images. So we hope in future we'll be able to do this a lot more effectively from the air and a lot more time efficiently than having to walk through all of those fields. What the element of the work that my team at Rothamsted have been involved in, or one of the elements, has been to collect seed from those populations, from those 150 odd fields. And this is just showing you some of the results where we've been looking at resistance to mesosulfuron, the sulfonylurea herbicide, and we were able to start to build up a picture of the degree of resistance. So the red dots show highly resistant populations, the blue dots are susceptible populations. And what we're able to see is there are some sort of pockets where there is still some control with that herbicide, and particularly up here towards the northern range of blackgrass, but a huge part of the country where those herbicides no longer work. Now again, we knew that this is just about starting to quantify that. And the reason for doing that is because what we're also doing for all of those 150 fields is collecting management histories. So we're involving farmers in this research, and we're collecting management data for the last 10 years of how they've been managing those fields. So essentially what we have is we have data about the populations, we have information about the frequency of resistance within those populations, and we have management histories. So what we're able to do is to start to join up all those data to understand which management practices have been, or which farming systems have through tracking those populations over a number of years, we're also able to start to see how management is changing in response to resistance and how effective that management will be in tackling herbicide resistance by studying what's happening to those populations over time. So I'm nearly finished. As I say, a really important part of this project is the realisation that we can't just be a group of researchers who are doing this research in isolation. Because black rust is such a major problem, we're constantly being challenged for how the research we're doing is going to make an impact. And I think we should be, because there's, whilst there's some really interesting scientific questions about evolution of herbicide resistance, and I'm particularly interested in some of those questions, the main point of doing this work is to tackle this problem and to have an impact. So as part of the project, we've formed a stakeholder group which includes regulators, environmental agencies, industry, farm agronomists, to really talk to them about what we're doing and get their feedback into the project as the project develops. We have farmer focus groups, so these are groups of farmers whose farms we're working on, who we talk to about what they're doing and what we're doing, and making sure the sort of solutions we're coming up with make sense in their own particular situation. I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to quickly go through this. So we talked about transdisciplinary research. I've tried to give a picture of, that was a major thing that came out of this workshop, the need to be transdisciplinary. And transdisciplinary research really means, or at least to my idea, you need to bring together many different disciplines to tackle these major problems, and you need to ensure that the stakeholders who are going to have the impact on the ground are involved in that research from the outset. So finally, I think our Horizon Scan has identified these sort of 5 major themes for future weed research. And so I guess a fair question might be, where do we go with here? So what does this all mean? Or is it just a sort of a fun, but I'm not going to say pointless, but where do we take all this? Well, I think I started out by saying I think it's really important that we raise the profile of the discipline. I just have a general sense that the importance of weeds and weed science is underrepresented. I think we're having trouble recruiting young people into the discipline, and I think in some way we just need to raise the profile and stress the importance of what we do. Perhaps we do need to be a bit better at conducting hypothesis-driven science, so making sure that the weed science we do is grounded in ecological and evolutionary theory, and again that has benefits in both ways. I think weeds can be really important economic organisms which we can use to ask really fundamental ecological and evolutionary questions, but at the same time, by asking those fundamental questions, I think we'll get a better understanding of weeds and weed management. And clearly what's come out of our Horizon Scanning exercise was this need for transdisciplinary research. So I'm going to finish up just by saying I talked about there having been 2 of these workshops. The third one is being organised to take place in Canada in 2016 around the idea of transdisciplinary weed science, and there's an open invitation to anyone who would like to attend that to make an application, and there's a website there where you can find further details. So with that,